Available everywhere
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Fantasy Sports Network. We are in the home stretch of today's show and we have two fantastic segments. One about a guy who, unlike the other receivers I've talked about, is in a situation that might not prove to be to his benefit, and then on a somber note, a running back who I kind of feel like I have to talk about but don't necessarily want to because it's a very sad story to tell. But let's start out with kind of the happier situation, shall we? With a receiver who, on any given time, can be in at least the wide receiver 5 conversation. But he's entering a year with a team that definitely has a lot of question marks surrounding their offense, especially how their head coach views it as well, in Davante Adams. There are going to be a lot of critics, a lot of skeptics talking about Davante Adams in this season. That is my bold prediction about a player like Davante Adams, and here's why. Davante Adams, no matter where he goes, no matter who his quarterback is always going to be one of the best receivers. Pick any wide receiver room in the NFL, and Davante Adams is at the very least their second option in their system. Very rarely do you see a guy like Davante Adams in this league. He's a fantastic route runner. He's very savvy. He's one of the most intelligent wide receivers in the league, and he offers a lot of value in terms of his production. And we saw it over many years in Green Bay, and now he's in Las Vegas, where it's kind of shaky. But let's go over the positives. Throughout his career, he's amassed 1,650 fantasy points. His best season was in Green Bay, though, with 243.4 fantasy points. And kind of going to show how he fits into a Las Vegas Raiders offense that clearly does not have the wide receiver options that Green Bay had. He had a 45% air yard share, 33% target share in the system, 103 receptions on 175 targets, another season where he went over 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns, and he's projected to have another fantastic season next year with 1,194 receiving yards for 6 TDs, not 600, 188.6 fantasy points rather for Davante Adams next season. I think that is highly reflective of what the Las Vegas Raiders are rather than what Davante Adams is, because Las Vegas, unlike Dallas, unlike Miami, is going to be heavily reliant on Davante Adams. And you might view that as a very good thing. You might want a receiver who is on a team that is going to go to him early and often. But also, there are just so many caveats, not just outside of who Davante Adams is to this team, but with their head coach. Antonio Pierce came out and said, as the interim head coach even, that he wants to focus on running the football. He said that two players he wants to focus on the offense and the defense were Josh Jacobs and Robert Spillane. Now Josh Jacobs is gone, but you get the idea. You get the gist of what Antonio Pierce wants. He wants to be a physical player. Now, Davante Adams has always been vocal about getting his fair share of opportunities. We saw it in that kind of riftish moment at the end of his tenure with Green Bay where he talked about wanting to get the ball more. He's already had frustrations with Las Vegas in terms of how they handled Jimmy Garoppolo and how he's not receiving as many targets under Jimmy G as he wants. And so Davante Adams is always going to be a very controversial receiver, no matter what. But I think that when you call into question someone of Davante Adams' caliber, you have to consider the fact that wherever he goes, he's an asset. And I think the same is true of fantasy. I don't think that he's going to be someone picked up early on, like a CeeDee Lamb or Tyreek Hill. I think he's definitely kind of one of my fantasy receivers because more often than not, he's going to be excellent. I think that you can't deny what Davante Adams brings to your team as a head coach, and Antonio Pierce will be kind of foolish not to at least say that Davante Adams is going to be your best player on that offense. And so I think that Davante Adams' ceiling is very high. I think that he's going to have a lot of projections. I think he's going to exceed them. And ultimately, I think he's going to have another fantastic, solid year. However, the caveat is he's going to have a lot of lowlights. I think it's going to be a very uneven year for Davante Adams. I think that when you look at this quarterback room, it's very uninspiring. Obviously, you have a guy in Gardner Minshew who's been around the league, been around a lot of teammates, had some decent stretches of football, but I don't think is someone you can rely upon to be a starting QB in the NFL, especially for a Las Vegas Raiders team who is transitioning and wants to rebuild. I certainly think that Gardner Minshew is a fine bridge option, but if you invest time into him, let's say he has a good season, I don't want the Raiders to be blinded by that. I think that in order for this to be a success story for both Davante Adams and Antonio Pierce, you really need to look to the future at the QB position. You have a guy in Aiden O'Connell who could be that future. I certainly think there is a lot to work with for him. I certainly think that being thrown into that situation was kind of daunting, and that's the reason why we saw so many failures with him. But ultimately, I don't see any quarterback in this Raiders room that is going to extend their stay with them. I think that the Las Vegas Raiders are going to be a team that desperately needs to look at a QB position. Because right now, it's looking like this whole experiment has just been one big disaster. And considering the fact that they invested so much into that duo of Jimmy Garoppolo and Davante Adams, you have to get at least a return on one of those two players. And Davante Adams now has to be that guy. Jimmy G has failed in terms of what this experiment means for this team. And so I'm looking at Davante Adams as someone who is going to hit a lot of times. I think that Davante Adams is going to try and strike up a rapport with both of these quarterbacks, say, hey, you can rely on me. Look to me to get you your level of production that you need, and for me to be happy and satisfied in this offense, and we will reap the rewards of that. But right now, Davante Adams is in a weird place, not just in real life, but in the fantasy landscape, where perhaps you're turned off by the quarterbacks, and also the fact that perhaps Antonio Pierce is going to want to incorporate some of his philosophies into this squad. And ultimately, I feel that like another huge part of it is Davante Adams' ego. He certainly feels as if he is one of the best receivers, and he certainly believes that he is one of the best receivers in the league. But I certainly feel like in a rebuilding team, even though you're pushing to be the number one go-to guy on it, you kind of need to let ego aside. I think that Davante Adams needs to find a way to reel himself in if things aren't going his way in order to be able to help this team, because it's not going to be about him always. And I think it's going to be reflected in his fantasy stats next year. But I think Davante Adams certainly can be a team player in every respect of the word, and how he plays for this team, how he elevates this team that's heavily in transition and trying to figure things out. I think that Davante Adams, in my humble opinion, is not a starter at the moment. I think he's a fantastic bench option coming off the bench, potentially having a huge game for fantasy managers everywhere. But right now, I think the focus for Davante Adams in his career lies within helping the Raiders. Because right now, that whole experiment looks to come crashing down on the Raiders' ownership. And it's not going to look pretty if Davante Adams doesn't bolster this squad. And so that's the primary keys I'm looking for Davante Adams as a fantasy prospect. If you prove to be more of a team player, I'll respect you more than if you swing for the fences and want to be a fantasy guy who's scoring 20 to 25 points a game. So that should just about do it for this segment of the show in terms of my player profile series coming up next. This is going to be a very tough segment to get through because this is one of my favorite players in the league, and it's kind of sad to see that moniker, that name brand being taken away from him as we look at him from a fantasy perspective and also in real life. So it should be kind of a somber ending to the show and this week on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed this segment because the next segment might be a brutal one. We'll be right back.